So you may have heard on my other podcast, Tales from the Break Room, that I am sick right now. So this episode is sort of a narration gauntlet. Let me see how many stories I can narrate this week before I feel like I want to die. But before I die, you should definitely head over to Eerie.fm. You can listen to this show and all the podcasts I narrate or host, and every EerieCast show, all in one place. And you can even sign up to be a premium member, which keeps us alive no matter what other platforms might do. And you get tons of hours of bonus content only for members. In fact, paying members get access to the Unexplained Encounters bonus story catalog. Stories you've never heard before, like the one I narrated a few days ago, which was about a mysterious bag of dog bones and what they made one boy do. That's Eerie.fm. EERIE.fm. Thank you. Haunting at 133 Fifth Avenue, Roebling, New Jersey. From Mark C. When I was younger, about 9 years old, we moved from Levittown, Pennsylvania, to 133 Fifth Avenue, Roebling, New Jersey. The house had been abandoned for quite a while when we moved in. My father had some work done on the place, and at one point the workers asked him when he made coffee. There was apparently coffee made on the stove, but he hadn't been there. No one had been. Not long after moving in, my brother and I were there sometimes alone, as my parents would be at bingo at the local firehouse. One night we were both sitting on the couch watching TV, when we witnessed what looked like blood dripping in large amounts from the ceiling, right in front of us. When my brother went over and touched the carpet, the liquid just disappeared. Then as my brother sat back down, we saw shoe prints running across the carpet, and you could see the actual impressions as it happened. Then behind those shoe prints, we saw bare footprints running after those shoe prints. Suddenly our front door blew open, and the screen door was ripped off the hinges. We both got up in our pajamas and ran to the bingo hall to our parents. That wasn't all. There were many occurrences, such as knives sticking to the walls, a hatchet in the back shed door on the inside of the house. We saw one night, my father and us two sons, a woman dressed in a white wedding dress, gliding up the stairs from the first floor all the way up to the third floor and into a room where she disappeared. My father and the two of us also had been awakened many times with some very heavy feelings as the covers were pulled completely off. My father contacted a priest friend of his from the army. He told him to make crosses out of aluminum foil and place them on every door. But then things got much worse. Eventually, my father's friend, the priest, came to bless the house, and he had all of us follow him to every corner in every room as he prayed. He started down in the basement and went up to the third floor. He threw holy water in every corner, and we kept hearing loud bangs and doors shutting. After we finally got to the last bedroom, the priest looked at this mirror, a very old one my father had found in the basement and cleaned up. That's when it all started. So the priest blessed the mirror. Then my father told him how he had found it. The priest said that the mirror was the cause of all these problems and that he was to give it away, not sell it, but to give it to someone who would willingly take it. He gave us a prayer to say every day to keep what he said was a poltergeist away. He said that he had researched the house and found it was built on ancient Indian burial grounds. Since my grandmother had recently passed away down the street, he said most likely it was her chasing the poltergeist out of the house. After that night, things became very calm, and even the feeling in the house was no longer heavy. The priest also told us the previous owner had hung himself in the second-floor bedroom years before. We ended up moving out of that house about a year later. We also asked the neighbors, and they told us the stories of the house we didn't know. It was quite an experience as a kid my age back then, so I'm definitely a believer of ghosts and poltergeists now. A horror I left in my childhood, and plan to keep it that way. From Ari. This encounter happened to me when I was around 6, and I tried to forget it ever happened, just so I can try to live a normal life. I would go to my family farm a few days away from my home nearly every year or so. I'd been going to this farm since I was a baby, so this place wasn't relatively new to me, and large, dangerous wildlife was an uncommon sighting, but not necessarily rare. I only hope that what I saw that day was just a sick wild dog, maybe some prank pulled on me by the neighbors that lived a little bit away. That day was going pretty normally, except for us getting a few new cows. My granddad was down in the paddocks with them for a while I stayed up at the house with my little sister, who was around 5 years old at the time. We were playing around with the old binoculars that our grandparents happened to have for us, so we wouldn't complain about being bored. At the time, I was spying down on the back paddocks from my house's back patio, as the cows down there had some funky patterns, like funny splotches of black and brown over the white fur, like a canvas with paint splatters, or the pattern my favorite cow had, like a messy heart over her shoulder. It was around 3 p.m. at the time. The shadows were already looming across the closer paddocks, and my granddad had started making his way back to the house, his jeans moving over his shaky legs that had been worn down by time, with his checkered black and red polo shirt that seemed to never age. I didn't pay it much mind as I continued to observe the cows. After a few minutes, the cattle started to go crazy, running around and stomping around with erratic movements. I slowly followed their eyes, and I saw this large dog-like creature with what looked like patchy black fur and deathly gray skin, which made it look like it came straight from the movie series Resident Evil or the movie I Am Legend due to its almost dead look. I watched it run against the fence line of the paddock near the cows with unnerving speed. It scared me out of my off-branded denim dress, as I had never seen a creature of that size or description around here. Luckily, it was on the side with the forest, and electric wires lined both sides of the fence, but I never actually got to get a clear look at what it was. The way it ran sent a shiver down my spine. I never told my parents or granddad either, as I didn't want to be seen as attention-seeking or a liar. I would continue to see it roam around that paddock for a few days, always running across the fence line, almost like it had a schedule it couldn't break. But it never stayed still long enough for me to actually see it. After a while, we ended up selling the house and moving away. I never got to identify the creature, but its unmatched speed and horror film-like run continues to haunt me. To this day, I try to stay away from my old family farm, and if I have to go near it, I'll take a detour. It knew my name. From Anonymous. People always ask why I remember every detail of this story so clearly. Temperature, sounds, even the exact position of furniture inside the shelter. I think your brain records things differently when it genuinely believes you might die. Every second from that night feels burned into me with unnatural clarity. I can still sketch the layout of the room from memory. I can still remember how the air smelled when I opened the door to leave the next morning. Most nights I can ignore it, but every once in a while I'll hear somebody whistle outside my apartment building, and for a few seconds, I'm right back there again. This happened in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan during the last week of January 2022. I'd gone out alone for 3 days to photograph abandoned logging sites buried in the snow. I wasn't inexperienced. I'd been hiking and winter camping since high school, and I usually preferred being alone in the woods. No traffic or people, just the weather and distance. I had a satellite phone, emergency supplies, and extra fuel. I wasn't some idiot wandering into the forest unprepared. The area I chose had once been active logging land back in the 1940s and 50s. Most of the roads weren't maintained anymore, but old maps still showed where the camps and supply structures used to stand. I parked my truck at a locked forestry gate and hiked nearly 7 miles north along a frozen road. Snow reached almost to my knees in some places. The woods there were dense enough to block most of the wind, which sounds comforting until you realize how quiet that makes everything. Even during daylight, the forest felt closed in. Trees packed tightly together, long stretches where you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Around dusk, I reached the shelter I planned to stay in overnight. It sat beside a narrow frozen creek at the bottom of a shallow basin surrounded by ridges. The structure itself was old but stable, with cinder block walls, a rusted stove, 2 small windows, and a heavy wooden door swollen from moisture and cold. Somebody had clearly used it recently. There were old food wrappers in the corner and melted candle wax on a shelf near the stove. The weird thing was the silence around the place. I couldn't even hear a bird out there. No distant cracking branches either. Nothing really. And I noticed something else before going inside. Tracks. Bare footprints leading from the creek toward the trees behind the shelter. At first glance, they looked human, but something about them was off. The toes appeared to be too long, almost more finger-like, and the impressions sank unusually deep into the snow. I crouched down to look closer and realized the stride between each print was enormous, easily 6 feet apart. I remember actually laughing quietly to myself because my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I told myself they had to be distorted somehow, maybe by melting and refreezing snow. Inside the shelter, I unpacked my gear, lit the stove, and tried to ignore those tracks. By around 9 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped brutally fast. The kind of cold where even stepping outside to pee hurts your lungs. I sat near the stove reading under a lantern for maybe an hour, when I heard the first sound. Footsteps moving through snow outside the wall just behind me. Very heavy and slow footsteps. I stopped reading immediately. The footsteps continued past the back wall toward the side of the shelter, crunching softly through the snow. I expected a knock at the door or somebody to call out, but instead, the steps kept circling. One full lap around the shelter, then another. I remember checking my watch because part of me still thought there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe another hiker. Maybe someone lost. Then those footsteps stopped right outside the door. The silence afterward was terrifying. I could hear the stove crackling and my own breathing, but that was all. I stared at the door for about 30 seconds when I heard the faint sound of something near the bottom. Scratching. Slow, raking noises like someone slightly running their fingernails across the wood. And then came the whistling. 3 uneven notes from somewhere outside near the creek. There was a pause after that, followed by the same 3 notes again. I can't explain properly why that sound bothered me so much. It sounded almost human, but lacked the rhythm. I moved to one of the windows, shining my flashlight toward the creek. At first, I didn't see a thing, but then the beam caught movement between the trees. Something pale stepped behind a cedar trunk. It was tall, much taller than a person, thin enough that I could make out the shape of ribs beneath its skin, even through layers of shadow. Its arms looked horrible, hanging nearly to its knees and so thin. What I remember most clearly was how it moved. Not like an animal at all. Animals move naturally, but this thing moved cautiously, as if it knew that I was watching. I backed away from the window right away, and the scratching at the door stopped. A second later, something hit the side of the shelter hard enough to rattle the stove pipe. This was no playful bump, but a full-body impact. It caused dust to drift from the ceiling. The lantern then flickered, and before I could even process what happened, another slam hit the outer wall farther down, followed by quick footsteps, circling the structure at a speed no person should have been able to do, especially in deep snow. The entire shelter groaned under the weight. That was the point where panic really set in for me. I grabbed my hatchet, not sure what I was going to do with it if that thing out there was really that big. The thing outside stopped moving again. There was more complete silence for a while, until, directly outside the door, I heard a voice speak to me. "Hey." Just one word, coming from what sounded like a man. He sounded calm and close enough that he may have been standing only inches from the door. I dared not reply. After a few seconds, it spoke again. "Can you help me?" There was this emotionless from the voice, like a terrible actor reading a line, not like a person needing help. But then, in that same voice, it said my first name. I've replayed that moment in my head 1,000 times, but there was no explanation for it. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, so nobody could have seen my gear, which might have had my name to read. No one had followed me from the trailhead. No one I knew was out here. And as my mind was boggled by what I heard, the door handle began to turn, slowly. But the door didn't open. The handle stopped moving. A few seconds later, something leaned gently against the door from the other side, and I could hear it breathing, whatever it was. And that's when the smell hit me, like a metric ton of various rotting creatures and roadkill. I backed into the far corner of the shelter, while that thing outside began dragging its nails slowly down the wood again. After 3 repetitions, there was silence once more. I waited for a minute before I heard the footsteps moving away toward the creek. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping that hatchet so tightly my hand cramped up. Every now and then I'd hear movement somewhere outside in the trees, but never close again. Just distant crunching through snow. One time I heard the whistle return far off in the woods, those same 3 notes. When daylight finally came, I opened the door carefully and stepped outside. Tracks covered the area around the shelter. Deep, barefoot impressions circled the building dozens of times. Some passed directly beneath the windows. Others climbed the snowbank beside the wall where something had clearly reached the roof. Near the creek, I found where it had been standing while watching the shelter. The snow there was compressed so deeply, it almost exposed the frozen dirt underneath. And beside those prints were smaller tracks. Deer tracks. Hundreds of them. All stopping abruptly at the creek's edge, as if an entire group had suddenly turned around all at once. I packed my gear and left immediately. About 2 miles back down the trail, I noticed something that nearly made me throw up from fear. A second line of footprints had appeared beside my own in the snow line near the trees. Bare footprints that were fresh. They moved parallel to my footprints for half a mile, and they appeared to have stopped every moment that I had stopped too. I finally made it to my truck just after noon. I remember locking the doors instantly after getting inside, even though I knew how irrational that might be. I was shaking like a leaf anyway. Before pulling away, I got the overwhelming feeling that whatever followed me out of those woods was watching right now. If you're ever alone somewhere remote and the forest suddenly goes quiet, do not ignore it. Don't try to prove to yourself that you're brave. There are places where your instincts notice things long before your mind does. If you ever hear someone outside at night calling your name from beyond the trees, yet so close to the door at the same time, do not answer. The reason I'm scared of the Tooth Fairy. From Willow Tree. When I was around 8 years old, my older cousin told me a story that I would never forget. This story is the reason why I can't sleep well at night sometimes, or ever look at teeth the same way again. My older cousin Jamie was always into scary stories, and always seemed intrigued when I got scared of those stories. But this story goes. Once there was a girl who was normal at first look, but she was peculiar and weird at times. Her family never knew why. Her only friend ever seemed to be her brother. He was the only one she would ever talk to. But for weeks on end, she wouldn't come out of her room, not even for food. She'd always tell everyone to go away. Her brother was worried and started bringing her food. But soon her food requests would get weird. Raw meat and bones in them. She would finish her food and push the plate back under the door. Her brother was getting scared, and each time he heard her eat, it was like it wasn't her anymore. The sounds sounded like they were coming from her throat. One day, her brother noticed a weird, sickly sweet, pungent stench. He knew that smell from when him and his sister found a rotting animal years back. He knocked on her door, asking if she was okay. The voice that came from behind the door sounded raspy and dry, not like the sister he knew. "Give me more meat," the voice croaked. The brother became scared and ran from the room, but something in his head told him to get the meat. It felt safer than just ignoring it. He came back to the room with the plate of raw chicken meat with bones. He wanted to open the door, but he was afraid. Then he pushed the nerves aside and opened the door. What he saw inside was a sight he would remember for the rest of his life. His sister sat in the corner. It looked like she was taller, as if her bones had grown. The skin on her body stretched on the bones. Her ribcage was almost like it wasn't even on her body anymore. The hair on her head had fallen out in clumps, only patches remained. Her head rotated around, her body unmoving, just her head, like her neck had been broken long ago. Her face was the worst part. Her teeth were gone, eyes bloodshot. Where her teeth used to be were bone fragments, shoved into the gums. Her mouth was covered in dry and fresh blood, and her face was so slim you could basically see her skull. He saw something protruding from her back, but looking at her made him sick. He threw the plate and shut the door and ran to his parents and told them what he saw. They went up, knocking on her door. The voice that came out sounded like his sister, completely normal. She told them everything was fine. His parents told him he'd been watching too many scary movies, but he knew what he saw. He knew that wasn't his sister anymore. He went to bed early, trying not to think about what had just happened, but he woke up in the night. Something was dripping on his face. He wiped at it, and the liquid that was on his hand after was red and sticky. He looked up. He saw the thing that used to be his sister, now on the ceiling, like she was floating. He finally knew what the liquid on his face was. Blood. Her blood. She jumped down from the ceiling. He wanted to scream, to get away, but his body would not react. He suddenly saw something weird around her neck. A necklace made of teeth. She opened his mouth, pulling out his teeth one by one, and he couldn't move, even if he wanted to. When she was finally done plucking out his teeth, she said, "Thank you for the teeth," in a voice that was not hers, the same voice he had heard behind that door earlier. He passed out, and the next morning she was gone, the room empty, door open. But now there was a pile of teeth that did not seem to be hers, smelling of rotting meat and adorning the walls. The boy had to get fake teeth, but he feared for the rest of his life that she might come back one night. My dad's experience with a Ouija board. From Mr. Steiner. I'd like to share a story that happened to my father. For a bit of background, I've always been into the strange and unexplained. From aliens and cryptids, horror and true crime, to parallel universes and time travel, you name it. My dad, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. He does not believe in anything he can't see with his own eyes. That's part of why this story has always stuck with me. He's not the kind of person to make something like this up, especially not a story like this. My father was born in 1955 in Brazil, of German descent. This incident took place sometime in the early 1970s in Sao Paulo, though he doesn't remember the exact year. He wasn't into drugs, at least that's what he says, and I do believe that part. But according to my aunt, he was a bit of a party guy in the younger days. He was always going out with friends. This story, though, takes place at a friend's house. That weekend, it had been raining heavily. A party they had planned to attend was canceled, so my dad and a few friends decided to just hang out at one of their houses and have a few beers instead. There were 4 of them: my dad, 2 guys, A and B, and a girl. B and the girl were siblings, both of German descent on their father's side. B was a big guy, around 6'2" and about 230 pounds, which will be important later. At some point during the night, the girl asked if they wanted to play with a Ouija board. My dad had never heard of one before, so he didn't know what she was talking about. The others agreed, and B went to grab the Ouija board. They started playing, mostly joking around and not taking it too seriously. But then the girl asked the board if she could contact someone on the other side, and the board responded with yes. For about a minute, nothing happened. Just as my dad was about to speak up and call it all nonsense, everything changed. The light bulbs in the house suddenly exploded. All the windows flew open with such force that some of them shattered. My dad said the cold that rushed in was unbearable, completely unnatural, especially considering it was the middle of a hot Brazilian summer. They were all terrified. Then B and the girl's mother walked into the room. Her expression was a mix of anger and concern. Instead of asking what they had done, she told them to go into the kitchen and wait. Apparently, she knew something about voodoo, what many people in Brazil refer to as black magic. Panicked, they did as they were told. From the kitchen, they could hear her chanting in what sounded like Portuguese and Latin. After a while, everything went quiet. Then came a scream, but it didn't sound entirely like her voice. My dad described it as layered, her voice mixed with something much deeper, much more unsettling. She began speaking rapidly in what they assumed was Latin. At that moment, B rushed in, desperate to help his mother. But as soon as he touched her shoulder, she grabbed him, throwing him clear across the room, out of the living room and into the kitchen. You've got to understand, this was a small woman, barely over 5 feet tall, and B, on the other hand, was a large, strong man. What happened shouldn't have been physically possible. That's when my dad and the others ran. They fled the house into the pouring rain, hearing B's mother screaming and cursing after them in that same unnatural voice. As for what happened afterward, my dad never got the full story. He knows that B's aunt was called in, someone who supposedly knew how to handle situations like this, possibly performing some kind of exorcism or ritual. But beyond that, he isn't sure what became of her. B and his sister never spoke about that night again. They avoided the subject completely, and over time, they all drifted apart. The 4th friend didn't have much to say about it either. As for my dad, he still doesn't believe in most supernatural things. But when it comes to that night, all he says is this: he knows what he saw, and whatever it was not natural. The Dog Man That Mauled My Dog. From Gremlin Studios 78. I'm sending this story because it has been weighing on me for years, and no one I tell believes me, though I've only told mostly family. I've always been an adventurous kid. I would always go out to the woods behind our house and play in the creeks and trees in the woods. I pretty much lived back there. You see, my family owned several acres of land around this family-owned cabin we all called the barn. We only farmed on a bit of the land, but the rest was just there, I guess, for us to explore. By the time I was 11, I knew those woods like the back of my hand, and I'd already gone on several hunting and camping trips with my dad. I had spent several nights in the woods on my own. I had a passion for animals and wildlife, but I also really enjoyed the unknown and the paranormal, although the cryptid side of the paranormal intrigued me the most. The only cryptids I knew about and obsessed over were Bigfoot and Mothman, which weren't really sighted in my area, although there was a family story about a Bigfoot sighting near the barn when my papa was a kid, though there hasn't been other sightings since that encounter. Anyway, we had a dog named Goose. He was a large German Shepherd mix that could be mistaken for a wolf if you saw him in dark light. Me and him were inseparable. We would go hunting, fishing, and camping together, which was great because we have bears in the area, and Goose could scare them off. He had done that before. When I was 16 years old, my cousins were going on a hunting trip, and I was invited to go, now that I was of age. Me and my cousins met at the barn with our camping and hunting gear. I brought Goose along, and my cousin brought his red-bone coonhound, Banjo. We headed out to the hunting grounds. We found a clearing near the creek and set up our tent. By then the sun had started to go down, and it was getting dark. We tied Banjo and Goose to a stake next to our tent and started a fire to cook our dinner. After dinner, we sat in our tent and talked about random stuff. Somehow, we got on the topic of paranormal creatures. This led to a conversation on the story my papa has of a creature on this land. None of us believed there was a creature out here, but even more so we believed that Papa would never lie to us, and this was a story he told in all honesty. My cousin, Audrey, who was the oldest on this trip, started telling the story that we'd heard 100 times, but no one stopped her. When Papa was a kid, he was told never to go into the far side of the woods, but no one would tell him why he couldn't go. He ended up agreeing to a dare from one of his older siblings and went into the far side of the woods. He brought a can of bear spray just in case he came across a predator in the dark. Long story short, he got attacked by what he called a dogman, which is a werewolf cryptid that can't shapeshift and just stays in the form of this wolf-man beast. My papa ran back to his house, and now this story is the legend of the family. After the story was told, we all were a little shaky because being out in the woods after hearing that story, well, it makes you hear things. We ended up telling bad jokes for another hour to clear the mood, then finally went to bed around 10. At midnight, I awoke to this weird feeling in my chest, like I was being watched. I sat up and looked around the tent at my sleeping cousins, and I looked out the flap and out the mesh window into the surrounding darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I still had the feeling that something was out there, watching. I heard Goose and Banjo shift on the other side of the tent, and Goose started quietly growling. I opened up the flap, telling Goose through the mesh that there was nothing. He and Banjo sat closer to the tent than before. In the morning, we all awoke to dew on the tent, birds chirping in the clearing. I crawled out and stretched, breathing in that cool Colorado air. Luke crawled out of the tent after me, and together we untied Goose and Banjo and took them for a walk. "Yo, last night I felt something, like we were being watched," I told Luke. Goose noticed it too. He was growling when I woke up. Luke was quiet, but then he looked at me and told me he had felt the same thing, and he'd also noticed that both dogs had reacted to something when he woke up. Yeah, around 3. It was still dark, and I woke up to something. Felt like something was watching us. I heard the dogs growl, but I couldn't hear anything other than that. Except at one point I swear I heard the bushes rustling. But I went back to sleep. I didn't hear or feel anything the rest of the night. We walked down the river, then back up to camp. When we got back, Kayla, Audrey, Sydney, and Seth were up and making breakfast, a mixture of eggs, bacon, and potatoes. We ate, then gathered our guns and hiked out to the ridge, where we would start our hunt. I sat in the bushes with my binoculars scouting the area. I could see scratch marks on trees from bucks rubbing velvet off their antlers. I spotted a herd of elk on the ridge across from us. The herd was made up of at least 7 cow elk and 3 bulls, one of which was a large 12-point bull in the front of the herd. The moment I saw that elk, I knew that would be my target. Luke and Seth saw some bighorn sheep on the opposite side of the ridge and started to head over to that area, bringing Banjo with them. Audrey and Kayla spotted some deer on the other side of the ridge Seth and Luke were hunting on. Me and Sydney went straight down to the ridge towards the elk herd, and Goose was trotting next to me. We set up an elk blind built from large branches and camo tarps we brought with us. I sat in the blind, rifle in hand, looking through the scope at the 12-point bull. That bull was about 200 yards away from the blind and standing in a position that gave me the perfect shot. I fired the rifle at the elk. It staggered and began to run, along with the rest of the herd, but we watched it drop about 10 yards from where I shot it. "Nice shot. Came down real quick," Sydney said, giving me a high five and starting to pack up the blind and heading to the elk. I let Goose run over to the downed elk as we packed up and headed his way. When we found the elk, Goose was growling again, but it was a small and scared growl, one I had never heard from him before. I stopped, and so did Sydney. The hair on the back of my neck began to stand up, and a knot in my stomach formed. The same feeling I got when our house got broken into a year ago. Me and Sydney stood there in silence, rifles up, pointing into the woods. Then, interrupting the silence, a crackle came over my walkie-talkie, and I heard my brother Seth's voice coming through the speaker. "Chloe, we headed back to camp and we're packing up. Banjo has been freaking out, and Audrey and Kayla have some weird feelings or whatever. We don't think we should stay here any longer." Me and Sydney looked at each other, then at Goose, then towards the woods that he was staring into and still growling at. "We'll start heading back," I responded to Seth through the walkie, and he said copy that. I whistled for Goose to come over to us, and he trotted over, the hair on his neck standing up, like he was scared. "We have to go. Looks like we gotta leave the elk, I guess," I said, disappointed, walking back through the woods to our camp. "Gonna try to come back for it later if I can." We'd only walked about 100 yards before the woods went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where there's a predator in the area, but eerily silent. It felt more like time had just frozen, and I smelled it before I saw it. A tangy, metallic rotting smell. I covered my nose and mouth with my bandana and tried not to cough. I couldn't attract anything to me and Sydney. Goose growled again, but then it turned into a whimper, like a scared little puppy he was. That's when I saw it. In the trees left of me, a tall, muscular shadow about 7 or 8 feet tall. Its legs were like animal legs bent at the ankle, like it could drop down on all fours and run naturally just like that. Its fur was jet black, its eyes glowing orange. They weren't reflecting anything. They were glowing, I was sure of it. There wasn't much light in the dense forest, nothing that could reflect on that thing's eyes. It was holding on to the closest tree to it with massive raccoon-like hands, with claws like knives on the end of each finger. But its head looked like a wolf's. I've seen wolves before, but this wasn't just a wolf. I reached for my rifle that was slung around my back, and so did Sydney. As I aimed, the wolf thing's lips curled back into a snarling smile, revealing too many yellowing teeth dripping with reddish saliva. The beast let out a guttural growl and stepped forward. It was walking on 2 legs. My hands started shaking, and I aimed my rifle, and so did Sydney. As it drew closer, Goose started growling again. The thing paused and looked away from us, towards the direction of our camp, its nose twitching, making a wet sniffing sound as it sniffed the air, sensing something we could not. It then looked back at us and slowly got closer. I fired a warning shot to the ground by one of its feet paws, and it took a staggering step back, letting out another growl. It crouched on the ground and rocked back and forth like it was getting ready to pounce. I fired 2 rounds into its shoulder, and it jumped back, letting out an alarmed yelp of pain and staggering slightly back into the trees. Then it howled, this blood-churning scream that echoed through the woods. The thing launched forward again, snarling. Goose jumped in front of us, barking and baring his fangs, and I yelled, "Goose, no!" But he didn't listen. Goose and the beast squared off, both growling at each other. Sydney fired another clean shot at the creature, which yelped, but still fought with Goose. Goose was big and fast enough to dodge all the creature's blows. At the time, I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there, but I could not bring myself to run away from my dog, my best friend. "Come on, Chloe, we have to go!" Sydney tugged on my arm, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from the fight. Then both of the animals stopped and turned around to face the same direction as the creature looked before. Banjo sprang from the bushes then. He released a type of growl I'd never heard before from him. He lunged at the beast and clamped his jaws on the dogman's neck, and it yowled. Sydney was finally able to pull me out of my trance and drag me through the forest as we ran. Branches whipped at my face and tears formed in my eyes as we ran and burst through the bushes. Eventually, we were able to see our camp. I collapsed in the dirt and sobbed into my hands. I was shaking. Seth sat down next to me and engulfed me in a bear hug. I sobbed into his shoulder until I finally calmed down enough to walk back to the barn. Luke had called his dad, my uncle, and told him we had a bit of a situation, that we had to leave our camp abruptly, without packing anything up. All 6 of us sat on the porch steps, waiting for my uncle. When he arrived, he and my dad and my Uncle Red asked what happened. Sydney explained her side of the story. So did Audrey and Luke. They told them that we left everything other than our guns at our camp, and Sydney informed them about our encounter, how Goose and Banjo had protected us from a beast. My dad's eyes widened when we told him about the monster. Both of my uncles exchanged glances. They asked us to lead them to camp so we could pack up, and asked me if I wanted to join them, and I told them yes, that I wanted to see if Goose was okay. We loaded up the side-by-side and the ATVs, and we rode to camp, which looked just like we left it. After we packed up all our gear, Sydney and I led the way to where we had the encounter. When we arrived, all the grass and underbrush of where we saw the creature last was now stamped down, like what the hayfields look like after we have a family gathering. The ground was splattered in blood, and there was no sign of that beast at all. But we did find the dogs. Banjo was unrecognizable. His fur was torn and shredded in a bloody mess of fur and mud. And we found Goose next. He was in better shape than Banjo, but still injured badly. His thick coat was covered in blood and scratches, and half his face was gone. He was still breathing, so we wrapped him up in a blanket, and Uncle Red rushed him out of the woods to the vet. When we got back home, we buried Banjo in Luke's backyard. My cousins and I never went back to that spot, or even in those woods again. I still hear those howls of that beast, Those eyes burned into my memory. Goose thankfully survived, although he lost the left side of his face and his left eye, along with one of his legs. I don't go out there at night anymore, and even after moving recently to a close neighborhood in the city, I don't like to leave my house without a handgun and my new dogs. To end this, let me just say, if you ever get the feeling you're being watched, and your dog begins to growl at something that you can't see yet, or if the woods go completely and unnaturally silent, get out of there before it's too late for you or the people and the animals you love. The light that brought a feeling with it. From Why Time. I used to live in a small town in Tennessee. Around 2024, when I was about 13 or 14 years old, my family had just sold our home. Because of that, the 6 of us ended up moving into a small shed that had been converted into a house. It wasn't meant for that many people, so space was really tight. My siblings and I all slept together in the living room, while my parents took the only actual bedroom. It always felt a little off living there, not necessarily haunted or anything, just uncomfortable sometimes, like it was a little too quiet at night, especially with the fields stretching out behind the house. One night, I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, feeling really thirsty. I don't remember what time it was, but I know it was deep into the night. Everyone else in the house was still sleeping, and everything was completely silent. I lay there for a minute, listening, but there was nothing. No movement, no talking, not even any outside noises. Eventually I got up, and I walked into the kitchen to get some water. Our back door was a sliding glass door, and you could see straight out into the field behind our house. As I walked into the kitchen, I happened to glance outside, and I noticed a light. At first, I didn't think it was anything crazy. My grandma lived in a camper next to the house, so I thought it was probably her. I thought maybe she couldn't sleep, so she was walking over to grab something. But the more I looked at it, the more it didn't make sense. The light wasn't coming from her camper. It was coming from farther out, from the cow field behind our house. I stopped and just stared at it for a moment. It was moving, for sure, slowly but steadily coming closer. But it didn't look like a flashlight, and it did not move like someone walking. There was no beam or swinging motion, just a steady glow, and the shape of it wasn't right either. It didn't really have a shape. It was just light, kind of shapeless, almost like a glowing presence instead of something physical. As it got closer, I started to feel something that I can't fully explain. At first it was subtle, but then it hit me all at once, a heavy feeling of loneliness and despair. It didn't feel like my own emotions either. It felt like something was being forced onto me, like the air around me had changed. It was overwhelming. I remember standing there, frozen, staring out the glass door at this thing getting closer. But I didn't run, and I didn't call out to anyone. I didn't move. Then it reached the fence, and it didn't stop. It passed right through, like it wasn't even there. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. My heart was racing, but my body would not listen. I was stuck there, watching as it kept coming. It reached the back of the house, and then it went straight through the sliding glass door, entering our home. The feeling got even stronger as it passed by me. It was like being hit with a wave of pure emptiness. What made it even worse was that it didn't react to me at all. It didn't look at me. It didn't slow down. It was like I wasn't even there. It kept on moving, drifting past me into the living room, where my entire family was asleep. For a second, I remember thinking it might do something to them, but it didn't. And it kept going, never hesitating, never interacting with the thing. It kept going in a straight line, Then it reached the front of the house, and just like before, it passed straight through the front door and disappeared. The moment it was gone, that feeling disappeared too, just like that. I stood there for a long time after it left, trying to understand what I had just seen and what I'd felt. I didn't go back to sleep for some time. I kept thinking about how wrong it all was. I never told anyone about it. In my family, ghost stories and things like that were usually brushed off or ignored, and I didn't think anyone would take me seriously. But I know what I experienced. I've experienced other unexplained things that I might share in the future. So thank you for giving people a place to tell their stories. Well, we basically made it to a full episode, right? Maybe a few minutes short. Thank you all for sticking through this with my nasally sounding voice, I'm sure. This has been Unexplained Encounters, and I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Send me your scary unexplained stories at darkstories.org, and support my show and unlock extra Unexplained Encounters stories over at eerie.fm. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.